Dang it. Okay, I'm going to start that over.
Do a little take one.
Okay. Sorry. Hey TID fam, welcome to season 2 of the Invisible Diaries. We're your hosts, Misty and Amber. I'm Misty from MistyBlueDream.com, a chronic illness lifer with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and a congenital heart warrior. I am a biomedical major, writer, mom, and advocate.
And I'm Amber from the AutoimmuneAdvocate.com. I'm a mom, health coach, advocate, and fellow chronic illness warrior. And together we created the Invisible Diaries to shed light on invisible and chronic illnesses through education, advocacy, and awareness.
The Invisible Diaries isn't just about sharing our story, but also including each and every one of yours. But first, a quick disclaimer. Any information discussed in this podcast is strictly our opinion and for informational purposes only. It is not meant as medical advice and should not be taken that way. Always consult with your doctor or medical team.
We know battling chronic illness can be hard, and if you find yourself or someone you love in crisis and need someone to talk to, you can call the National Suicide Support Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, which provides free and confidential support in the U.S. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, that number is 1-800-273-TALK.
Any cited resources mentioned will be linked on our website, theinvisibleddiaries.com. Now let's get started. Cara Boileau is a graduate student at UCF pursuing her master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. She is passionate about reducing the stigma surrounding mental illness and recognizing that trauma affects everyone, both directly and indirectly. Cara's goal is to promote advocacy and education on mental health from a holistic and integrative approach. Cara, say hello and introduce yourself and introduce, dang it. Okay, we're just going to go with it. Everybody, I'm a mess today. Sorry about that. So let's go ahead and have Cara introduce herself. And I'd love for you to also share how you came to the path of becoming a mental health counselor.
So hi, I'm Cara. I just want to say first off, just for ethical and legal reasons, I'm not a counselor. I'm a counselor in training in the counselor education program at UCF. It's really kind of like a very endearing story, I think, as far as what led me to this point. And I think it kind of ties into some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. But unfortunately, my little sister passed away 2 years ago, and it was very related to mental illness and issues surrounding that, complications, I think, that were related to the healthcare system and how there's a lot of things lacking as far as integrative care and having your different practitioners who don't necessarily communicate together and things like that. So my sister, I wanted to make meaning out of her passing and looking for a way to kind of give back to the community and learning from that loss. So I leaned into that and kind of pursued that as my path moving forward.
I love that. I think that's so sweet. And I know we also wanted to discuss toxic positivity, which I'm a huge advocate for. I know this is a subject that you wanted to discuss, and I'm grateful for that. So I wanted you to explain, I guess, coming from you, what toxic positivity is and how it can affect an individual and what we can all collectively do as a whole to combat this epidemic.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm excited. So I want to start with like a definition that Dr. Jamie Zuckerman put out there, which is that toxic positivity is the assumption either by oneself or others that despite a person's emotional pain or difficult situation, that they should have a positive mindset. And like you might want to think of like when people talk about positive vibes. So we're being inundated with these motivational memes, these inspirational Instagram posts, and then even like the platitudes that people tell us throughout the day of like, you know, just look on the bright side or just keep going and like all that kind of stuff.
It's going to be okay.
Yeah. So like when we get to that place though, we're forced or expected to focus on the positive, and it robs us of the opportunity to have that full emotional human experience. So like
I love that.
Yeah. So being able to go into that, it really, when we have these like toxic positivity moments, whether it's with our friends or just the way that we engage in social media, we have our emotions are invalidated or minimized, or we're just being denied the ability to feel those negative feelings, which could be like anger, loneliness, sadness, any of those things that make people generally pretty uncomfortable if they're not the ones feeling it.
Right.
That's so true.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, it's like, well, why does this matter? You know, at the end of the day, when we cut off our ability to feel these specific feelings and we disassociate from them, we stop listening to the valuable information that these emotions are giving us. Because at the end of the day, these negative emotions are still there to protect us and give us information about what we're experiencing on a day-to-day. So for example, fear warns us about any kind of perceived danger. Anger lets us know that there's an injustice happening. Things like that, where we're, or even anxiety. Anxiety lets us know that we're caring about something. So when we are not able to feel those feelings, then we kind of just become detached with reality completely. And
Oh, I love this so much. You're doing so good. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
great.
So then what happens when we start to deny those emotions and those experiences, we go into secondary emotions, which are like guilt and shame. And that's what kind of bubbles to the surface with this toxic positivity, because it will, you're seeing like a bunch of people who are just depressed and anxious, and they're like questioning their self-worth on a daily basis. Um, so
Yeah.
I think right now, during the pandemic especially, we're being faced with so many hardships, whether it's financially or, mentally.
Isolation.
Yeah, exactly. And to kind of like have all these people who they're uncomfortable with it themselves, so they just kind of create this narrative like, oh no, it's okay, without actually being allowing themselves to go through the motions of feeling those feelings. um, and, that,
Absolutely.
and that's what kind of creates that toxic environment, because instead of moving through something that's painful, we're denying the pain, but then creating even more a more harmful condition.
Right. And I actually think that it kind of creates a barrier as well, because if you're feeling like these, so-called negative feelings, I feel like because we're not necessarily allowed to talk about those feelings towards others because of shaming or toxic positivity, people not being welcome to that, or calling the negative Nancy or Debbie Downer. It creates a barrier for people to want to ask for help in the first place.
Yeah. Because then it becomes, you start to have those thoughts like, I'm a burden. My friends aren't even going to want to be around me or talk to me because I'm the one who's just bringing everybody down. And then that plays into the whole like depression, because you're too afraid to reach out when you really need that support. So you just isolate yourself even more and like dig your grave even deeper.
Right.
I love that you point out too that negative emotions don't make you negative, because I think there's such a weird like stigma with regards, like you say, it is a part of the emotional spectrum. So to deny that you have negative emotions because things happen that you feel a certain type of way about is kind of just denying half of your existence.
Yeah, like we're only supposed to think positively, and that's it. Like, shame on you if you think like you're pissed because you had a bad day or whatever.
I really like looking at emotions on a spectrum. So like when we put ourselves in a position where we're only feeling like this side of it, we are also closing the other side of it at the same time, because we can't cut one off without making the other one shorter as well. So we end up in this weird situation where we feel like we're making ourselves so that we're not engaging in those difficult emotions, but we're also reducing our ability to engage with those positive emotions as well.
Right.
So true.
So what do you think we can do collectively as a whole to make a difference in this toxic positivity?
So the main thing you want to do in this situation for like yourself or others, whether it's like reducing the type of exposure in social media you're putting yourself, like if it's helpful, okay. But at the same time, I would encourage people to question like, is this truly helpful? Or am I just doing this because it's what's expected of me? Am I trying to fit into some kind of mold? And then on the other hand, when you engage with other people, realizing that the language we use is super important. So instead of saying things like, just don't worry about it, stay positive, it could be worse. Or like my least favorite thing in the whole world is when people say everything happens for a reason, because that's just absolutely not true, right? Because those types of things are saying, you're too much, or you don't deserve to feel this way. Like that your life's not really that bad. Or even like this pain that you're feeling is like a blessing in disguise. It's like, it's completely invalidating. So what we want to do is really show up for someone and say, in the most authentic way possible, I'm here for you. I see you. I know this hurts. And if there's something that I can do to support you, please let me know.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you don't understand it, and then it's okay to say like, hey, I have no idea what you're going through, and this, but I'm here.
Yeah, that like just breaking it down to like one simple response for everything, which is just like, how can I support you in this moment? Because we don't know. We can't know what someone else is experiencing, and we don't want to project what we think is a need when it's not.
And I think that that's part of the flip side of social media, is because we're so used to quote unquote that highlight reel, that it's just like best foot forward, best life always, that it's like, but the whole point behind social media was about connectivity and community. And part of that is the other side of it, which is like, yeah, I'm having a crap day. Like, welcome to my crap day. Anybody else having a crap day? Because we talk about, which I think, when you live in a culture that is like always up, 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 it's A, it's exhausting, and B, it's not sustainable.
Yeah, you're polarizing people, right? So you're either saying like, you're either with us in this positive movement, or you're the problem. Yeah. And that creates like people who want to end up numbing themselves, or, just completely disengaging with their emotions, which causes a whole myriad of problems. And like you're saying, it would be great for people to like normalize the negative experiences of life, because we can't have positive without negative. It just doesn't, that's how it is. So being vulnerable and willing to share those like bad days and say, I'm a successful business owner and I'm allowed to have a bad day.
Yeah. Because then it's not perfection, because it doesn't exist.
Right.
Which I love. We see that a lot in the chronic illness community, obviously, because like mental health, it is not always visible. And so living with chronic illness comes with its own intense amount of stressors. And given that those suffering from chronic illness are at a significantly higher risk of struggling with things like anxiety, depression, adjustment disorders, those kinds of things, compared to, let's say, someone that doesn't live with chronic illness, how important do you think something like cognitive behavioral therapy is with chronic illness management? And do you see it as another possible tool to add to one's chronic illness management toolbox?
Yeah.
That was a lot.
Sorry. I want to start by saying like cognitive behavioral therapy is absolutely an excellent tool to address any kind of discrepancies between our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings. So with that in mind, it is one of the most researched evidence-based treatment modalities. A lot of times it is covered by insurance, which is super important. And if you are one of those people who find that your thoughts are limiting your ability to function, or if you're having some sort of core belief that is holding you back from moving forward, like for example, I don't know, like if you start saying to yourself, like you're limiting your ability to live the best life because you believe that your illness is making you like a victim or something like that. Like I'm saying that without judgment when I vocalize that, but there comes a point where we can kind of challenge those thoughts and say, is that really true? Like, is that, can you do more than you're willing to show up for? And kind of challenge that. There's a lot of different kinds of cognitive distortions that could happen and show up. I think when that comorbidity between mental illness and chronic illness at the same time. So being able to kind of approach it from that situation can be helpful. That being said, I do believe that CBT may not be the best option for everyone, because when you think about it, we're challenging thoughts that are distorted. They're disruptive. They're not true. So whether that's an all or nothing thinking, catastrophic thinking, you're shitting on yourself all day long, those are things that we definitely want to challenge. But if you're experiencing things like grief, for example, as part of your journey through your illness, then we aren't going to challenge your grief. Like your grief is valid. So
well, and what about just, just in general, having what we call an invisible illness where people just don't believe you. How do you, what do you do about that? Like, that can be really hard on its own when you feel like you don't have a support system. A lot of us really look to people online.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for me, one of the things I wanted to mention was that there are other therapy styles that are available that might be more beneficial, whether it is like mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy, or what is the other one? Acceptance and commitment therapy. So those things are going to be more about, when we talk about that window of tolerance with our emotions, we learn, or the counselor will assist you in teaching you to sit with those difficult emotions so that window gets bigger. And that you are, the longer you can sit with that pain in a way where you're not feeling the need to resist it. Because like a lot of times, even if you think about it from an exercise standpoint, whenever there's too much resistance happening, that's when we strain ourselves, right? So like, we don't want to be emotionally strained. So by building this window and flexing these like emotional muscles in therapy, we get to a point where our physical pain actually does become reduced with our emotional pain becoming less, because whether we like it or not, it is connected. When we don't do that, then when we become disengaged with our emotions, that's when like dis-ease comes up in the body, and then that can manifest in a bunch of negative ways.
Absolutely. Well, and the reason that I asked you about cognitive behavioral therapy is because I think, since we were talking about toxic positivity, a lot of times people confuse getting tools for positive lasting change with being positive. And so I think sometimes that gets a little manipulated in our world with invisible illness, just because it's like being positive is what leads to positive change. And that's not always true. So it's such an individual tailored kind of treatment. And so that's the thing. And we are very familiar with that. I mean, two people can have the same illness and have completely different manifestations with symptoms or a treatment plan. And it's same with mental health, I'm assuming, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So like for me, when I'm working in the clinic with my supervisor, one of the things that I really am strongly promoting is the ability to show up for each client in that moment, and not going in with a specific idea in mind of like, what is going to be, like, what do I want to do? It's not what I want to do. It's like, what do they need right now? How do I show up for them? What is the problem that they want to address in this session? And how do we get that? And conceptually, how does that tie back into our original goals when we started the therapy and the therapeutic relationship?
Well, and a lot of times I feel like people in the community with chronic illness, we're almost like afraid, or at least I know I am personally, like afraid to admit that I struggle with depression, for example, because we have been so used to being told that our illness was in our head, or that, it's just stress, or maybe if you just dealt with your depression or anxiety that, you'd be better. So, I mean, how do we address something? How do you suggest addressing something like that, where you feel almost as if you can't even acknowledge your mental health and fear that your physical health will be questioned or invalidated?
I think from my perspective, like, it sounds like it's a marginalized community, right? You're being othered, you're being consistently invalidated. And then that kind of goes into the whole idea of toxic positivity, which we were talking about before, is whenever someone is invalidating your experience, then those feelings of shame and guilt rise up. And then it will immediately bring you into those places of, you know, you might have paranoid thoughts and not want to engage authentically because you're going to be judged, and you feel ashamed because you are expected to be something other than like you can show up. Like if you're having a bad day and it's hard to get out of bed, then when somebody tells you, you know, work hard, play hard, you're like, I can't do anything hard. I'm tired.
I'm gonna lay here.
I love that.
Imagine, Misty, if practitioners on the general practitioner side or specialty side of medicine took that approach where they walked in and said, how can I show up? What's this patient need from me today?
I know.
I love that, Cara.
Or in the physical health world. Yeah.
Because it's almost like, I think, and like what Misty was saying, you know, from a mental health standpoint, when you're already suffering from something that you can't see, and you have a professional that doesn't validate because they only have a certain amount of tools and not to say that they're all like that, because again, it's a spectrum even with practitioners, but that you can't get an exact answer. So you have all of these feelings from a physical symptom standpoint, and then you have the secondary, you know, mental and emotional feelings and you know, manifestations that happen too. So I think it's a weird place to live in, like this invalidation on both the emotional, mental, and physical, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine how exhausting that really would be on a day-to-day basis. And having to not only be physically and mentally exhausted, but then also spending your energy advocating for your group of people and your representation in the community. I think that is kind of like why it goes into the space of counseling being really appropriate, because you're given permission to feel these things. Finally, like you can talk to someone and they're not going to judge you. And it's like, we know that this experience is very, very real, and we're never going to be in a place where we're questioning that.
I feel like mental health counseling should be it should go hand in hand with, well, for everybody, but as far as like our community, I feel like it should just be a given. It should be something that we have to go through or see somebody in order to figure out how to get to the point of acceptance, or how to, you know, I mean, which is never going to be a linear, you know, we're never going to just travel straight to acceptance and stay there. We're going to keep circling all around and back, because that's just how it works as far as having the chronic illness. You know, you might have a good day where you feel like you accept it, and then you might have a really bad day where you're like starting all over again, and you're pissed and whatever. So I feel like mental health is such an important part of chronic illness that does kind of get put on the back burner.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what my point was with this. I just got lost. But
yeah, like one of the things that's coming up for me when I hear you say that is my idea of like being more holistically minded is that we don't, and moving away from like the medical model, which I have strong reactions to, that we can utilize the mental health community and therapy as a preventative tool rather than just an intervention. We don't need to wait until we're overcome with sadness and depression and anxiety to seek out help. Being able to sort of train your brain to work in a way where you're not going into fight, flight, or freeze before you get there is going to be much more advantageous than waiting till you're already at the bottom and you're like, someone help me get out of this hole that I've dug.
Yeah, we're huge advocates of being as proactive as possible and less reactive if you can. I mean, it's not avoidable at all the time, but
I think that's a very important point to say too, just because I feel like that's kind of when we do go into therapy, when we're at rock bottom and we've lost it, and
waving the white flag.
and then you still have that whole process of, you know, making your appointment, getting to your appointment, letting them, doing your evaluation, setting your goals, and then where you actually kind of get to know each other. And so, I mean, it's a process to get to that point. So why not start in the beginning or early on, where as you're dealing with stuff, you can be like, oh, hey, by the way, I want to discuss this today because I've had a horrible week, versus, like you said, waiting to the crisis mode.
Yeah, that's the one good thing that I will say about this pandemic is that the availability of telehealth right now has risen astronomically to the point where even with like registered mental health interns, they're now being allowed and being given permission to practice remotely and use these platforms so that people who do have chronic illness who maybe not have the access to go into the appointments as readily now have that a little bit more wiggle room as far as how do we make the appointment, how do we create this contact and connection.
Yeah, I love that.
Me too. super awesome.
Before we move on to our next topic, I did want to I guess just address when you don't necessarily have like a support system, because I'm fortunate to have my family and I have an amazing support system, but I feel like I can completely understand where people can kind of get in that the darkness when they don't have that support system. I've been having a couple of really rough weeks, and even just like this morning when I woke up, I had some very horrible thoughts, and my first thing was, well, I have this amazing family, and I can't imagine, like, when you feel like you don't have anyone, how to get through your day, when you don't have a support system. So what can you recommend for people who don't have someone who they can go to or discuss or just fight for, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So from like a counseling perspective, not having social support it's a critical like red flag for us as far as like mental health goes. Like even like with like the SLAP assessment for suicide risk, it's one of the key components. If someone doesn't have someone in their proximity as a social support, then they're automatically at higher risk for those like types of behaviors or the suicidal ideations. And it's critical, it's dangerous. So being able to find access to other like-minded people, it's unavoidable for that need to be met. And it's hard right now, especially during COVID, because there's not as much availability physically to go and have that sense of community. So I would encourage everybody to, whether it's like an online community that you can join, I'm sure like you have plenty of resources when it comes to that sort of thing, or even just going out on a whim and trying to reach out to someone you haven't talked to for a while. It can be vulnerable, but at the end of the day, it might be more rewarding than the opposing part of it, of just not being connected to anybody.
So it's a
hard
lot
to
of
really give much more advice than that.
Oh no, I think it's a great point. I just kind of want to bring up the topic because a lot of times I hear people who have like a rare disorder. I heard it just recently the other day from someone, and she was saying how there's nobody here, and so she feels very alone. But it's like, well, and so I went on and I did the hashtag for her disorder and found, a couple of people that are advocates for her to follow and get connected with. But there may not be anyone here locally, but there's people outside of that. And I feel like one of the great things about social media is that you can connect to these people that you wouldn't normally be able to. And so joining, like Amber and I have, the Invisible Diaries has a group, for example, or just following accounts like us and other like-minded accounts who, are advocates. It's a great way to feel like you're not alone, and that you can kind of make these virtual friends and have someone to connect with. And online support groups like on Facebook as well, there's so many of them, and they can be very helpful. So I feel it's important to remember that you aren't alone. And even if you are going through a hard time, that's why we're always trying to encourage other advocates, because sharing your story, it might be hard, but there's going to be someone who's looking for your story to feel like they can connect with you and not feel like they're alone.
The representation that happens is what gives people the ability to feel connected and seen and validated. Like, even if you don't have a conversation with the person on the podcast or who's posting on Instagram, you can relate to the content and you feel validated in your experience. And just having that for a moment can pull you out of that space of feeling isolated and alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's important for us. We say all the time, like, show up as you are. Like, we're just holding space because there is no right or wrong way to do this. I mean, obviously being harmful, we're like, our DMs are open. If you're in a place that's that you're headed down that path, please reach out so we can help you find somebody.
For sure.
But just showing up, just holding space and just being there, I think is incredibly important, because everybody's at a different place in their journey. And so it's not being like, well, if you're not as happy and upbeat as I am today, keep your negativity over there, because that's not what we're about at all.
I love that.
Yes. So I would love to discuss grief, not only for those with chronic illness, but those without chronic illness as well. I've personally known many people who have recently lost a loved one, for example. I'd love to learn a few coping skills for losing a loved one, but I'd also love to discuss how grieving applies to chronic illness, such as grieving the life you once had or the life you wish you could have, and a wellness plan to cope with that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, like, during the pandemic, again, like we've all experienced lots of different levels of loss, and that can be difficult to define. I mean, obviously we have some people who are experiencing true loss or not true loss, but like typical loss through the death of someone that they love. But then there are the other types of losses where if you have financial hardship that shifts your whole livelihood, or you do become sick, or I know that the divorce rates have been extremely high during the pandemic. So now you're losing this life and this identity of being a wife or a partner, which is creating a lot of situations where people are grieving and they don't know what to call that. So one of the things that I was hoping to kind of share with you is that there is this concept of ambiguous loss, which Pauline Boss coined the term in the 1970s. And it's essentially a loss that occurs without closure or clear understanding. It leaves a person searching for answers, and it complicates and delays the process of grieving and often results in unresolved grief. So I think that that's kind of like starting out. I really want to just put that out there because sometimes it helps to just name something, right?
Mm-hmm. We love naming things around here.
Yeah. So like, again, that could be anything from your child just went off to college and now you have an empty nest and there's still that loss there, or someone you love is in the military and they're deployed and there's just an emptiness and a loss that you can't quite describe, because even if they're physically still alive, then they're not with you anymore. And then you have that ongoing questioning. And going away from that, but still related, is the whole, we know the Kubler-Ross grief cycle of like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But the piece that isn't really talked about that my mentor kind of brought up to us more recently is this idea of making meaning out of loss. It's kind of like the sixth piece. You've accepted it and it's like, okay, well, now what do you do with that acceptance? And there's several ways that this can show up for people, which is the first one, finding or creating a sense of understanding about the loss. So just kind of making sense of what actually just happened, because it can be so shocking to your system. It can be so traumatic that you lose a sense of reality completely. And then the second piece would be thinking about benefits and establishing meaning by emphasizing any positive results from the loss. Now, this can be extremely difficult because it kind of goes into that, well, everything happens for a reason and look for the silver lining. And that can be just compound someone's pain if you say things like that. But if you allow the individual who's experiencing the loss to identify those pieces for themselves, such as resiliency or empathy or insight, things that we wouldn't have had access to for ourselves previously without going through this very difficult experience. And then finally is the opportunity for identity change, where one is able to kind of reconstruct their identity and change who they are from the event that had happened and the loss. So it's important to work through the process of meaning and like to attend to all the attachments related to the loss too, because that's how we connect with being able to see what are the positives, or taking an inventory of how the grief process can be healing as well, because we're transforming through it if you let it happen. Sometimes
I love that word. Transform. That's a great word. Because I think that's, and I don't know about you, Missy, but like with my own experience with chronic illness, the identity loss has been the hardest part, because that changes often. Because it's like you say, I mean, one day you're able to do a certain amount of things. And so that you're like, okay, this is who I am today. Today I'm an athlete because I can exercise. And then tomorrow you have a flare, and then suddenly it's that shock to the system. Like you say, that happens on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times throughout the day. So it's dealing with that cycle, sometimes wrapped up really rapid in a short amount of time.
Yeah, we kind of have to, I feel like we kind of have to reinvent ourselves a lot, you know, like for me with my career, my last career, I was a workaholic, and I worked a lot, and I worked hard, and I was always going, always busy. But, you know, I had to basically face that one day and decide I can't handle this anymore. And that's you know, one of the many things you have to accept. And the list just kind of goes on depending on whatever your chronic illness is. It could be progressive. So you may slowly have to kind of tweak your schedule and your identity and, or what you do for a living, or maybe you don't have a job anymore, you can't work. And then it's like just constantly trying to find your ever-changing purpose, you know?
Yeah. And one of the things that I really hope that people are able to access in those times is a lot of self-compassion, because I think we put expectations on ourselves to perform. We know this version of ourselves that used to exist, and we want to constantly compare ourselves, but that's not fair, because that person doesn't exist anymore. So we can only show up as our most authentic selves in the moment.
Love that too. Cara, you're rocking my world today. Love all these things.
Kind of going back to like our previous point, it definitely ties into the grieving process too, as far as finding social support. And I highly encourage finding a support group for grief, or for chronic illness, or whatever it is that your loss is related to. Tons of different Facebook groups, different websites, but the hard part of grief is that it can be so incredibly isolating, right? So when that happens, we don't really know what's going on. We don't know, we're having a hard time understanding. And then on top of that, we are living in a world where people don't see our grief. It's another unseen experience. So people are expecting you to perform the way that they knew you were prior to your loss, prior to your grief. And then how do you reconcile that when you know in your heart, like I'm walking around with this giant devastating wound that nobody can see. You have people coming up to you and wanting to give you advice, or make things all better, but then you're never actually being seen or heard or validated with that piece, with that pain.
Right. And I think it's important to also address that not everyone is going to be able to understand what you're going through. And something I bring up sometimes, just that I used to have like resentment or anger towards friends because I would be laying this heavy stuff on them, expecting them to listen and be there. And they really just truly had never been through that, or had no idea how to deal with it. And they just really had nothing to say, because they didn't know what to say. And when I realized that, you know, not everyone is really equipped for that, and that I needed to see a therapist to be able to discuss these things, because they are they're trained in that. That's what they do. And they can handle that. Whereas putting that expectations on my friends was not really the right thing for me to do. And that's made my friendships better and stronger, because I wasn't expecting them to necessarily be that person.
I have a question, Cara. So I think sometimes with my own experience, when someone is trying to be helpful because they think that, you know, well, I grieve this way, so this is how you should be grieving, you know, because or my grief was way worse than your grief, because that there always seems to be like this comparison game with like who has it worse, or I don't know, it's a weird thing that we do. But do you have any suggestions with maybe being able to set a boundary with someone when they're trying to be helpful in that sense, where it's like, okay, well, it's been 2 weeks, you've been sad long enough, like it's time to move on. And how maybe you could communicate, because sometimes those people that mean the most in your life are the ones that are the most hurtful unintentionally, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So how can we help bridge that gap?
Yeah. Well, there's like, I think it's from Nora McInerney's book. She says in that, comparison is the thief of joy. And so I think that is definitely applicable in these kind of situations where people tend to like project their experiences or get to the point where they're comparing, and it's just not very helpful in any kind of capacity. And I actually did make a point, because this was important for me to bring up right now, is that this kind of goes back even to like the toxic positivity, right? Like people show up for you and they just want to be like, everything's going to be okay. And it's like, but it's not, or like, maybe it will be, but when? Because this sucks right now. And they're so uncomfortable with your pain that they're not willing to hold space for it at all. So the best thing that people can do, or even like what can we do with ones who are suffering with our loss, is just communicate that, being like, listen, I know that you're trying to help me and that you really care. And it would be extremely helpful to me if you just allow me to a safe space to just process through this. Can you just be there with me? Or letting them know, that this isn't helpful for me. And I will let you know what maybe a need is that you can meet, because sometimes people want to be helpful. They don't, maybe they don't have the emotional capacity to sit with you with that heaviness, but they can cook you dinner. They can do an errand for you because you're too tired and that you don't have the energy to continue doing that, right? So being able to communicate what you do need, because they're trying to help you, will be like pretty beneficial, I think. And then also just recognizing that, or even reminding them that not everybody's experience is the same. Like if me losing my sister, somebody else losing a sibling, even though it's the same type of loss, we're not experiencing it the same way. I can't expect them to know what my experience was, or that I can just tell them what worked for me and that it's going to be fine.
100%. Yeah, because there's so many things that are different. I mean, your relationship with your sister. So many variables. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that, we see it a lot in our community, and just because I think that, again, there's just a division there, because some people are like, well, I have this thing and I somehow manage, so you should be able to manage, but it's just not knowing everything else behind the curtain. So I love that. Thank you. So you've given us a lot of great tips, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, because this is such an important topic, mental health, and we are huge advocates for that on this platform, but on all of our platforms. So how can people find you and connect with you if they want to, and also learn more about your wellness tips and education on mental health?
I've recently created an Instagram account. The handle is @mindfully.well, where I'm sharing my wellness tips and education on a variety of mental health topics. It's still in its infancy, so there's not so much there right now, but it is something that I'm hoping will grow with me as I grow into my professional identity. And I'm happy to, if anybody wants to ever drop me a DM or has any specific questions, I'm happy to help as much as I'm capable. And if I can't, then turning them into or referring them to a resource that might be more beneficial.
Yes, awesome. And we will link that on the blog as well. And we did want to also remind everyone that we have a Patreon. So if you go to, I think it's patreon.com/the Invisible Diaries, but double check on our Instagram. And you can actually listen to our bonus content, which is like the after show conversation, which is always really fun. So don't forget.
Oh, and also our community on Facebook, because we do have a private group. So we talked about a lot of things that were private today. And obviously we've made that safe space so that it's not just anyone that can come in and comment. So we're pretty careful about who we let in.
Yeah, get that support.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one more reminder. So in the beginning, in November sometime, we're going to be doing our care packages. So if you feel like you don't have a support group and the holidays are coming up and maybe you don't have a lot of family or you're just having a really tough time, you can email us or reach out to us and just send your address and maybe things you like or you're allergic to or all that good stuff. And we will make sure to send you a little care package just before the holidays.
That's amazing.
Yay.
Yay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening. And as always, we ask that you leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to.
Also, make sure you are following us on Instagram and Facebook for the latest updates, and subscribe to our website where you'll find all the details from today's podcast, as well as other amazing resources. Don't forget to check out our latest issue of the Invisible Diaries magazine.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you want to share your story or be featured as a Spoonie Spotlight, you can apply on our website, theinvisiblediaries.com. Bye!